What is stagflation and are we heading towards it? I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. The world is facing precarious economic situations across the board. In America, there are problems with things like baby food and the shortages there. Gas prices have skyrocketed. The stock market has imploded. What does this mean, and what are we looking at right now? Well, each of these items has their own problems. The stock market, for example, is not the economy, and the economy is not the stock market, but some signals are pointing towards a deeper problem, and it's called stagflation. Now, I say it's a deeper problem because its roots will touch upon basically everything I listed off there to begin with. Stagflation is a situation, economically, that's characterized by slow economic growth and relatively high unemployment, or economic stagnation, so nothing is actually growing, which is at the same time accompanied by high inflation. So, to summarize there, stagflation, a situation where there is high inflation, growth has stagnated, and unemployment is on the rise. Now, this was first recognized and observed during the 1970s when many developed nations experienced rapid inflation and high unemployment as a result of an oil shock, which in some ways we're experiencing right now. The Ukraine-Russian conflict has certainly created a supply shock, and it's in part resulting in the insane variability in prices that we're witnessing at the pump. Now, this phenomenon, a supply shock happening to a key commodity or service, is typically one signal that stagflation is on the horizon. But it has to be paired with one other thing, and before we get there, just to clarify what I mean by supply shock, it's an event that suddenly increases or decreases the supply of a commodity or service, and typically a key one. In this case, we're looking at decreases. And it really isn't just gas and oil. It is, as I mentioned, things like baby food and even some produce as well. Supply chains are still crippled from COVID. And now, with international tensions rising and sanctions being levied against certain governments, the situation hasn't been improving. It's the opposite. Things are getting worse, and supply shocks in the negative direction are compounding. Now, typically in this first warning sign, what you start seeing is prices are on the rise and economic growth is slowing because production is just too costly and less profitable. Now, typically the second signal that comes with that first one and indicates stagflation is on the horizon is a government that has created policies that harm industry while at the same time growing the money supply too quickly. And we certainly had that not too long ago. Whether it was for the betterment of society or not, you can debate that, I'm sure. The fact is that policies were enacted during the pandemic that did harm industry. It's my opinion that it was necessary, and it was overall for the good, but those lockdowns and quarantines and closures, they had an impact there. And while the government did that, obviously, people need income. So the money supply went through the roof. We were going brr with the money printer, giving people money hand over fist and just printing out more, rapidly increasing our debt and relying on the central bank to foot the bill. So to recap, you have these supply shock events. You have industry that's been hindered and slowed down, forcibly, in this case by the government, and the central bank has been printing money at rates that we've never seen before. They're unprecedented. And of course, that's going to do things to inflation. Now, this is worrisome because in the 1970s, where these things occurred as well, economic situations become really bleak, or they became very bleak. Things like the misery index were created to gauge how badly people were doing overall. Because prices were skyrocketing, employment was on the downward turn, and your savings were evaporating because of the rapid inflation rates. This perfect storm is something that we have to avoid. But what can we do? So it's pretty clear that these signs are starting to show up on the horizon. People are worrying. The stock market is reacting adversely because they're trying to bake in these concerns. Actions intended to lower inflation, though, on one hand, may exasperate unemployment. And this is the tricky situation that you enter when dealing with stagflation. It's a multi-pronged problem, but tackling one prong usually makes the other one worse. To make this example more concrete, here's a scenario. The government realizes, or the central bank realizes, that inflation has run away, so we have to start doing things like tightening up our interest rates, rapidly increasing them, so inflation can at least a little bit be tempered down. Well, what's going to happen? There are businesses out there who rely on low interest rate loans to keep themselves profitable, or at the very least operationable. Now, as these rates go up, things get tighter. Maybe they have to lay off some people to cover that expense. Maybe they have to shut down. Maybe they can't afford to operate anymore. Well, that's that cycle that can happen. But on the other hand, if we want to rapidly decrease unemployment, or at the very least temper it, like what we did during the pandemic with actions like CERB, inflation tends to increase because we're rapidly doing things like pumping money into the system, or making loans so cheap that people are very incentivized to take a risk and start a new venture, which will in turn have employment opportunities for people. Now that's all well and good, but inflation may begin to creep up again. And as a result of this tricky situation where pulling one lever makes the other go up and vice versa, it is commonly agreed upon by economists that there is no definitive cure for stagflation. Now, the speculation is the best thing that can happen is that employee productivity has to increase. Has to get to the point where it would lead to higher growth without additional inflation. For example, an employee, either due to things like rapid technological advances or breakthroughs in education or processes, can do far more with their time now than they could in the past. And this has been a trend that we've seen over time. Obviously, as tech increases, as we get smarter, as we get better equipped, people can do more. Essentially, if we can just burst through the problem of lower productivity, it is speculated that stagflation would temper off across the board and we won't have to take measures that will increase one parameter but worsen another. Now, this is shaky, but it is perhaps the best that we can hope for. Stagflation does tend to resolve itself over time, but if you look at the 1970s and use a measure like the stock market, it took quite some time for things to recover. If you check out the Dow Jones and where it peaked around the early 1970s, it took something like over a decade for it to return back to that level. And roughly the same trends appear across multiple indexes. Now, to be very clear, it's not certain that we're going to encounter this same problem. We may have learned a couple things since then, and perhaps the government and economic bodies will have some clever maneuvering that they can deploy to guide us away from a stagflation hellscape. But on the off chance that something like that does occur, what kind of impacts can you expect? Well, the first thing would be your money rapidly losing its value, and that's attributed to the inflation rate. If your $1 can get you a loaf of bread today, and the inflation rate grows to 10%, well, it'll cost you $1.10 tomorrow. And as the inflation continues to compound, it'll not just impact your bread purchase, but everything you purchase. Can you afford an extra 10% for your yearly grocery bill and your gas and whatever else that you're expensing? That's one of the problems here. And combating inflation typically is done through investment. Things like bonds, equities. So your money is growing, hopefully at a pace that is greater than the inflation rate. But if what we've seen before during stagflation periods holds true this time, the markets are not going to do that for you. You're going to be in a very precarious situation where your money is declining in your bank account, and in the stock market the same thing is happening too. And your only hope is those safer investments that guarantee you a return, like a bond. But will those coupon rates be higher than inflation? Probably not if we're looking at a rapidly inflating era. So that's one thing to keep your mind on. Further, as we've alluded to before, there's the basic fact of things becoming very expensive. There might be certain cutbacks that you have to do that include things like maybe traveling less when it comes to driving your vehicle, because gas has just become an astronomical expense. Maybe being smarter at the grocery store. You have to stick to the basics. You can't get all the treats you want. Then, as stagflation worsens, unemployment tends to shoot up because economic activity is stagnating and the costs of production are becoming quite high, And as things like interest rates are ratcheted up to try and combat inflation, it just becomes more expensive to operate a business entity. Now, that higher unemployment can affect a variety of people depending on how bad things get. Then it'll be on the government side of things to figure out how to deal with that. Now, as this train continues to chug away, you're going to realize that as unemployment increases, there's just less money circulating. And now things like countrywide metrics are in jeopardy, like our GDP and our overall productivity. And it's a nasty cycle that spirals out of control from here. You find yourself in a situation where the economy has tanked, the stock market has tanked, the job market has tanked, and you're looking around and things are seeming quite bleak. A misery index is quite fitting here to take a pulse on just how bad things are. It is my feeling that short-sighted government maneuvers and constant calls for quick fixes and rapid spending and money printing are going to lead to a certain demise of economic buildup. Whether that's going to happen now or next time, if we can keep kicking the can down the road, there has to be smarter decision making that isn't just within a 4-year time frame. Politicians have to be concerned with the future, beyond just their term or the next election. Being short-sighted at the helm of an entire country leads to problems like this. Now, of course, there are other things that can compound the equation that aren't necessarily short-sighted, but I think we can all agree that we could have better planned for what seems to be unfolding right now. And as I've said, there's no guarantee that we're going to find ourselves in a repeat of the 1970s, but it is possible. And the indicators seem to be showing that that possibility is quite evident. Perhaps we can do things like coming together as an international community to really figure out a resolution to something like the Russia-Ukraine problem, which has contributed to the massive supply shocks that we've seen. And maybe by doing that, a domino effect happens where things begin to get better across the globe economically. One thing is certainly for sure. We do live in interesting times, and as always, I'll keep you up to date on the latest. Now with that, it does bring us to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the material, be sure to leave a review and share to help us grow. And you can find me online at perryplatform.org and on social media at perryplatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.